Hi, folks. We're Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the appeal that socialism appears to have, particularly for the young, but also for many others, and particularly people coming in from the third world who are being brought into the West en masse. So there's quite a big public now that perceives socialism is a good thing. Now, the perception of socialism by, say, third world peasants is that it's a whole lot of free stuff for kids coming, transitioning to adulthood from childhood. A transition that's happening much later in life now. I remember thinking how adult some people were at 17 because they'd left school at 14 or 15, had become apprentices or something like that, and me, who was still a school student, I was thinking how grown up they seemed, or even kids leaving school, finishing senior high school, and they'd come back to the school, the year ahead of me. They come back to the school married with a child, and I thought, oh, goodness me, how grown up they are. But that growing up phase has now been pushed forward by probably 6 to 7 years approximately. So whereas people would grow up at 18, or have to grow up quickly at 18, now at 25, they're still children. And we see that in the college kid sort of generation. They're being kept as, starry-eyed children, ideological fanatics for much longer than would have been the case when certainly when I was at school, when the number of kids going from high school to college was around 2 or 3% or so. Anyway, there's quite a big public for socialism now. Now, socialism has never worked. In some cases, the failures have been spectacular because in order to enforce the mass ideological conformity that socialism demands, typically means that you've got to kill off people who you don't like or throw them in prison, which has happened in every single attempt at a socialist society, communist socialist society. Every single one of them has been the same. Millions of people have had to die for the ideology to be implemented. Even then, it wasn't successful. They just cowed the population, and there's a pretense of going along with it, but the minute that they've got the opportunity, the people shake it off. They don't want it, in spite of supposedly all the free stuff. So socialism has never worked. They've been brutal killing fields associated with every attempt to implement it, whether it be in the Soviet Union or in Eastern Europe and so on. The only ideological or quasi-ideological government that was implemented and done so without the need to kill anybody was the Nazis. When they instituted that, there was roughly 1% of the population was non-German, whether they be Jewish or Gypsy, and even in throwing in the Marxist agitators and activists, around 1% of the population in total was considered to be the enemy. So the number of people being persecuted, and even then, the Nazis didn't try to kill them. They just tried to evict them or say, "Why don't you leave? We'll even help you. Look, we'll give you money to leave. We'll give you free services to leave." So that was the gentlest implementation of ideology ever seen. Later on, things became rather unpleasant, and that doesn't mean to say that Marxist lesbian agitators weren't put in prison, but they were put in prison for the agitation, not simply because they had the wrong point of view. And that's again a difference between the implementation of by ideological fanatics. So if we go down the path to socialism, I hope these kids and other people realise that the end game is mass murder on a grand scale. Nonetheless, why would socialism be attractive at all? Well, the type of people who are being brought into the West from third world countries, they tend to have a communist or socialist system of village existence where they share what they have to a large extent. The tribal chieftain will still, have rights to pick the hottest chicks to screw them. The things like that still go on, but they've got a communist system where they share what they have, and they do so willingly. It's just how they survive. Now, they've got nothing because they're pretty much living hand to mouth, these people. They're really still in many ways hunter-gatherers in attitude and views. They're not really very good at planning for tomorrow, and they tend to have very tribalistic, blood relatives type ties. And whether you go to Pakistan or Bangladesh or Africa or rural Afghanistan, it doesn't really matter. They've still got these views of sharing what they have, but they don't have very much. They don't have the sort of material things that exist in the West, because their societies are unable to create wealth other than a handful of aristocratic type elites. They're filthy rich. The Aga Khan or something in Pakistan, but for the majority, they just share. They live a peasant existence and they share what they have. So when they come to the West, they look around and they go, "Holy crap, you have so much." Look at the ordinary people who have nothing, where these third world folks come. Well, the ordinary people own nothing, and here ordinary people own cars, they own houses, they have nice clothes, they have all the things that these peasants from third world can do. You can flick a switch and the light comes on. It's like, wow, holy fuck. So the ordinary people have so much. And like from our culture, you should share it with us. And if you don't share it with us, then the government should give it to us, because, we share everything. Why won't you share what you have with us, particularly given that you have so much? And that's particularly the case in their culture, where someone who comes back from fishing and they say, "Well, gee, I caught 100 fish today," and that's way more than the average. Then the whole village expects, "Well, you'll share that fish with us." And given most of the stuff they get is sort of perishable and so on, like fish, or they kill some animal to eat, or something, a deer or whatever, antelope or something, then you can't really store it. They don't have any refrigeration. Again, this feeds into this mentality of, well, whatever you have, you share. And if you have quite a bit more than the others have, then that's all the more reason why you should share it. So they're already predisposed to a very socialist outlook on things. So when someone like that dude in New York, Zohran Mamdani, says, well, free transport, free this, free that, and we're going to do this, and we have all these goodies we're going to give away, and we're going to tax the rich and this sort of thing. So these third world people, they're going to take from people who have it to share it with us who don't have it, and which is how they would view things in their own country, with their culture. So it fits in very nicely with their own culture. They're not socialist as in an ideological sense, but they're socialist as in whatever we have has to be put on the table in the middle, and then we all share it out more or less equally. So it's a social a socialist mindset, excuse me, but without the ideology to underpin it. But now, for the college kids who are going there, and there's a lot of those, they used to, again, it was 3%, and that was only the brightest kids. Now college in Australia and Britain and so on is 50, 60% of the kids that start high school go through the university system. Now, sure, it's bullshit courses like gender studies and peace studies and, black lesbian studies and, all that sort of stuff. But nonetheless, they're going through college and being radicalized that, white people are bad, Western society bad, colonialism bad, capitalism bad. And if you look at pretty much every speech these activist kids make, that they always, apart from condemning white people and men, and they always manage to throw in capitalism as being evil. And capitalism is evil because the resources are not shared out equally is the primary complaint. Why are there rich people and poor people? And if outcomes are not equal, there must be something bad. Socialism creates equal outcomes, therefore socialism good. So that's the simplistic sort of thing. But if no one's creating the wealth, how can you share out wealth you don't have? Which is the same as these peasant societies in the third world. They've got nothing to share. What they do share, the very little bit that they have, they share, but they don't have any big ticket stuff to share. So it's not an issue for them. And because they've got no wealth to share, but share as wealth declines, then the overall amount of wealth declines. Then what each person has also declines. Now, in the case of say the communist, the Bolshevik revolution, and so on in Russia and what later became the Soviet Union, they took the wealth that was already there. So they had sort of if you like, a baseline of wealth they could take. And so they acquired everything that was in private hands, put into government hands. And the lowest peasants, they moved the lowest peasants from the rural area, because it's mainly an agricultural society, into the city. And they lived a very wretched existence. But over time, they managed to give everyone or most people anyway, give everyone a some shitbox apartment. Some of them where the walls were so thin you could spit through them. But they managed to give everyone an apartment. Typically, toilets and kitchens were shared, and so you'd hardly, in Western terms, you'd hardly call it a high quality existence. Many basics of life were, you'd have to stand in line for hours to get bread a lot of the time, and basic food stuff. So it was no easy gig. You could argue that the poorest peasants that had existed in the Russian Empire, the Tsarist aristocratic empire, they were better off. The people in the middle at the upper end were worse off. But did it work? Well, it failed because they were still fixated ideologically, created equal outcomes, and therefore they had to build so much artifice into the structure, whether it be creating jobs and these sorts of things, particularly in the area of creating jobs. So if one person was needed to do the job, they would hire 10 people to do the job, but just give them one broom, so that at any one time only one person could be sweeping the floor, even though there were 10 floor sweepers. so efficiency and producing results wasn't the issue in the same sense as we would view it in a KPI capitalist driven West. But the complaints about the situation today in the West are very real complaints, and they're genuine. The cost of living is high, rents are through the roof, cost of food is high. The essentials that you have to have, the things, accommodation, food, energy, these things are all have had, gazillion percent type price increases and inflation, whereas things that are optional that you don't have to have are typically in competitive marketplaces. For example, the sort of vehicle, motor vehicles you can get today, and the features and the bells and whistles on them, and the cost of that stayed fairly competitive overall. And so, in some, consumer electronics and these sorts of things, the sort of like the sort of television you can get today in dollar for dollar terms cost the same as it did in 1970 with the old cathode ray tube televisions, when color televisions first came out, for example. So you can get a television today that is vastly superior technologically in every conceivable way to that seven, and it costs the same, as in it cost $1,000 to buy it back then, and it cost $1,000 to buy a flat screen TV today. Not top of the range maybe, but certainly well featured. So optional consumer goods where there's market competition, then you can still get stuff at very good price. And the inflation there has been quite minimal or even non-existent in some cases. If you look at the price of an entry-level motor vehicle now in dollar for dollar, purchasing power terms, it's slightly cheaper than it was in, say, 1970. And you get a lot more features in it. You get all sorts of things in it that, like, even a basic entry-level radio was an optional extra. When I remember I bought my very first car, it was, had no radio, had nothing in it. All that stuff was extra, and they licked you big bucks if you wanted to get a radio or some sort of a sound system in there. But in the things you have to have, the rents, the mortgages, the food, the energy, and so on, they're all, far more expensive. Just to illustrate the point, 2 liters of milk is now the sort of pretty much the standard entry level container for. You can get smaller amounts, but that's pretty much the sort of the state of 2 liters of milk. Now in Australia, at least, this is entry level milk. This is the it's $3.30. I think it's now for a 2 2 litre container of milk. Now, I remember when I was sort of first was I had my own apartment and all this sort of stuff. So I'd have been, what would I have been? I don't know, late teens or something. The 2 litres of milk, excuse me, 2 litres of milk back in the days, and we're talking like late 70s. I mean, 2 litres of milk was what was it? 27 cents. So 27 cents for 2 litres of milk, and that was the mid-level sort of, right? You could get more expensive milk or the super El Cheapo milk, but that was the mid-level. Now that same mid-level milk now has gone up by about 15, 16 times. The entry-level milk about the same. But wages have gone up 11 times over that same period, but the price of milk has gone up 15 to 16 times. So what's the difference? Why has the price of milk gone up much faster than? And this is where we can say capitalism has failed or is failing. There were dozens of milk producers. I don't know how many, but well over 50 milk producers in Australia at the time, and they were competing and so on. So the price of milk reflected serious market competition. Some would have like premium product stuff with higher fat content or this or skim milk or whatever, the whole range of milks that were available, but there was a lot of competition there. Now today there's almost no competition. All the milk production has been bought up by 2 or 3 multinational firms, and they control the prices as an oligopoly or a cartel. There's no attempt. The government has allowed this to happen. The government has given the green light to these multinationals to come in and buy up all the milk production and milk processing and that sort of stuff. So that's the difference. Now, if we look at the cost of general groceries, for example, there were 9 major companies competing for the grocery dollar back in the day. Now there are sort of 2.5 places competing for the grocery dollar. Needless to say, the prices reflect that. When you look at any food stuff, and it's the key, like if it's an optional thing, like say exotic mustards or then you don't that's not a staple day to day. But you look at any staple of the product, whether it's bread, whether it's milk or eggs or any of those sorts of things, their prices have gone up well ahead of wage inflation. So that is, you're paying more for them. But in every case, there is reduced competition. In some cases, no competition. The number of banks that were competing for the consumer dollar in 1970 or the 1970s compared to today. Back at the time, there were I think 13 or 14 banks competing for the. On top of that, there were credit unions and all sorts of things that were competing for that. Now there are 4, and they're all operate in unison as a cartel. So wherever we look, what's happened to capitalism is that it's ceased to be capitalism. It's turned into cartel, oligopoly, monopoly, crony capitalism. That's the problem that we're dealing with today, and government and big business have fused into one, so that the government no longer represents the people, which is another issue of what's called capitalism, was associated with democracy, or at least to a large extent. You could say there were hybrid economies, like say Singapore, where democracy might be limited, capitalism was permitted, and you could look at those, but they're aberrations. They're outside the Western beltway of places like Britain, the United States, where the government, to whatever extent they did at the time, represented the people and their wishes, and capitalism went hand in hand with that, because for a capitalist economy to work, people have to have choice. consumer choice, and they have choice of policies they want to vote for, and the two went together. We've lost that. That's gone, and so consumer choice is now severely limited. Market competition has disappeared on things that we have to have. So when it comes to delivery of energy, water, anything we must have for our existence, competition has gone from that. Again, it's all monopolies, cartels, oligopolies, and crony economy type structures, and public-private partnership and endless amounts of cronyism that go into those. That's why we're paying. That's why we're paying more. Even in things like, say, tolls on toll roads, the government years ago said, well, we can't afford to build roads because we've got to put taxes up. We don't want to put taxes up, so we're going to give it to the private sector to build the road, and then you have the option to consider of using it or not, and this sort of thing. Now that's fine, but that's fine in principle as a talking point. The reality, though, was quite different. The private companies want guarantees of high, supernormal windfall profit. They want guarantees of the profit, whereas government never needed guarantees of profits. They're providing a public service. Did they do that efficiently? Probably not. And the private company, does it do it more efficiently? Well, yeah, but they want guarantees. The private companies guarantees of windfall profits. So they want to be able to put the price up of the toll, use of the toll road, well beyond the rate of inflation. And so, but they want to force people to use the road, so they close off the other roads. They say to the government, you have to close off all the other roads that people might be able to use. We don't want the consumer to have a choice. We want them to be forced to use this road, and we want to be able to charge whatever the fuck we want to for using this toll road. So people are forced onto the toll road that they don't want to. If they had proper choice, they wouldn't use it because they don't want to pay the high toll, but they're forced to do it. And this is effectively how modern capitalism, crony capitalism, is working. It's forcing people to buy things that if they had a choice, they wouldn't buy, or if they had a choice, they wouldn't do. And, if the only choice of milk is X, then you've got to buy it. The only choice of bread is, I remember buying loaves of bread when, as a kid, again, as a young man. I'm not talking like a 5-year-old here, but as a young, I remember buying loaves of bread for 20 cents. And they'd be from a local bakery depot, so they'd still be warm and fresh, freshly baked and still warm when they arrived in the grocery store. So if you went to the grocery store when it opened, you'd actually be picking up warm, fresh bread to buy, because the bakery depot was a local one. It was all distributed around. This has all changed now, and it's centralized and sort of mass produced, so that the bread is already almost half stale when the fucker gets to the supermarket. There's a couple of, one central location that it's made from, and then distributed from there all around the city to all the grocery stores. But bread, that same loaf of that same loaf of bread that was less than 20 cents, I'll say 20 cents just for that's now $4.50, that same loaf of bread. So that's gone up 27 times when wages have gone up 11 times. So bread effectively is double the, in purchasing power terms, is double the price that it was 50 years ago. So this is where capitalism has failed. There's efficient capturing of guaranteed high windfall profits for business, most of it offshore, where they're able to do a tax minimization scheme. So it's not as if the local government is getting taxpayer, getting the benefit of local taxes here. So these are the things. This is why capitalism is seen as having failed, because we're paying a lot more for getting either the same or a lot less, and thus the standard of living, the purchasing power of the paycheck has gone through the floor. And so people quite rightly, and if you add to things like the gig economy, for example, you throw that in there, and people are saying, well, hey, capitalism's not working for me. It seems to be failing, and therefore, what else? What else can we do? Now, what we can do is come back to competitive, merit-based capitalism. But merit's been thrown out the door. People are getting, Indians who are coming in from India with no qualifications or skills are being gifted government jobs as they walk off the plane. And companies have quotas for hiring, black lesbians and goodness knows what. Because of this, people who have the capability and the skills, the qualifications, the expertise, they're being denied employment, whereas people who do not have the capability are being gifted employment. And so, any way you look at it, this results in the perception that capitalism is failing, whereas in reality, it's the policies that have been put in, the globalist policies, where the globalist cabal says, look, you support globalization and we'll give you monopolies, we'll give you, bonanza profits, we'll give you guarantees, you'll never go broke because of all the money. And this is what's causing capitalism to fail or be perceived as failing. And I think it is failing. And if on the average wage, the average wage, even if you look at an entry level property like a 1-bedroom apartment or something like that, it's still consuming 65% of the average wage, up from days when it would be 15 to 18% of the average wage would be taken up by such an entry level property in rent, for example. So has capitalism, or is it failing? Well, yes, it is, and it's been restructured to suit a very small crony elite, and this is giving the perception or the reality that capitalism is failing. But is socialism the answer? Of course not. The answer is to get rid of the globalists and return capitalism and democratic elections and representative government to what it once was. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.